In a little village of Germany there dwelt a young man who was most unfortunate in everything he undertook to do. His father had been called Jonah, so Jonah was likewise his name. His parents died while he was very young, and he went to live with a tall, scrawny aunt, who assumed the task of rearing him in the way he should go. Now, spare the rod and spoil the child was no part of her creed, and she punished him religiously, on general principles, every time she returned home from early Mass. Since never a day passed that she did not go to early Mass, you may judge how sad was his plight. Oh, he was very, very unfortunate. If he chanced to lift a glass, it was always sure to fall with a crash, and as sure as he stooped to pick up the pieces, just so sure was he to cut his finger. Thus he fared in all things. By and by, there came a day upon which the scrawny aunt was gathered to her last rest, and he planted as many bushes and trees as her grave would hold. It almost seemed as if he were bent upon heaping over her all the many sticks she had broken on his back. Yet his evil star was still on the ascendancy. At length he fell into a state of deep melancholy, and he resolved to wander forth into the wide, wide world. Worse cannot befall me, he thought, and perchance I may better my condition. At least there's no harm in trying. So he put all his available funds in his pockets and wandered out of the city gate. Outside he paused a while on the stone bridge and leaned over the railing. He looked down at the waves which were breaking in foam against the pillars of the bridge, and his heart was heavy. It seemed to him not altogether right for him to leave the city where he had dwelt so long. Perhaps he would not have had the courage to tear himself away had not the wind suddenly blown his hat from his head. It fell into the river, of course, and before he fully awoke from his reverie, it had drifted under the bridge and was already dancing up and down the waves on the other side of the stream. And every time it rose on the crest of a wave, it seemed to call to him mockingly, "Goodbye, Jonah, I am off. You may stay at home if you wish." Then Jonah shook the dust of his native town from his feet in anger, and went on his way without a hat. Occasionally he met other wanderers, singing and joking along the way. They invited him to join company with them, but each time he shook his head sadly and said, "Nay, I am not fit company for anyone, and would bring you small luck. Indeed, I am called Jonah." No sooner did they hear his name than they became silent and embarrassed, and proceeded upon their way with such haste that they left a cloud of dust in their wake. Toward evening he came to an inn, and sat in a lonely corner of the dining room, with his head in his hands. Before him on the table stood a tin tankard filled with wine, untouched. Finally, observing his deep dejection, the innkeeper's daughter crossed over to his side and touched him on the shoulder. He started as if shot. She asked him why he was so sad, and he told her his story. As soon as she heard his name, her compassion took sudden flight, and she retreated to her spinning wheel and left him alone with his thoughts. And thus it was, where'er he went. After he had wandered about for a few weeks, without really knowing whither he was going, he chanced one day upon a wonderful large garden, enclosed by a high gilded railing. Through this fence he could perceive many very high old trees, and thick, low hedges, as well as open stretches of greensward. Babbling and purling over its pebbles, a little brook wound in and out among the trees, with many little bridges spanning it. Tame deer and gentle does walked up and down the paths of yellow sand. They paused beside the fence and stretched their heads through the iron railing to eat the bread he held in his hand. In the center of the garden, a stately palace towered amid the trees, its silvered turrets, from which bright flags and banners were streaming, glistened in the sun. He strolled along the fence till he came to a large open gate, which seemed to invite him to enter. A long, shady avenue led directly to the castle. Utter silence reigned on all sides, but near the gate he espied a sign. "Aha!" thought Jonah to himself, "that is always the way. If one ever does reach a peaceful spot where an open gateway invites one to rest, there is always sure to be a sign posted somewhere, 'No trespassing allowed.'" But, to his great surprise, on drawing nearer, he saw that for once he had been mistaken, for this sign read, "No one is permitted to weep in this garden." "What a foolish inscription!" cried Jonah, drawing out his handkerchief and wiping his eyes to make sure they had not deceived him. Then, too, if it really read that way, he was so accustomed to weeping that he could not be sure that a stray tear or two were not yet lurking in a corner of his eyes. When he had assured himself that his eyes were really dry, he entered the garden. The stately avenue rather embarrassed him with its air of elegance, so he chose a little side path leading between high hedges of jasmine and roses. He followed this until he reached a little wood, whose many paths all wound to a hill, on the crest of which he espied a most beautiful princess. In her lap lay a golden crown, upon which she was blowing her breath. Then she rubbed it with a corner of her silken robe, and laughed in glee when she beheld its polished surface. Then she smoothed her long hair, and again set the crown on her head. Poor Jonah was stricken dumb with fear when he beheld her. His heart beat so loud that it well nigh suffocated him. Whatever should he do? He dropped down behind a bush. It was a barberry bush, and one twig lay squarely across his face. There was quite a breeze stirring, and as the twig swayed lightly to and fro, a thorn kept tickling the end of his nose. There was no escaping the consequences. He had to sneeze aloud. The princess turned in sudden fright, and beheld the luckless Jonah cowering behind the bush. "What do you want?" she cried. "Why are you hiding there? Do you wish to rob me? Or are you afraid of me?" Thereupon, trembling like an aspen leaf, he emerged from his hiding place behind the bush. The princess took a look at him. "You mean me no harm, I see," she said, laughing. "Come, sit here beside me. My companions have all left me, and I am lonely. Perhaps you know some pretty tale to tell me, or one to make me laugh? But good gracious, how sad you look! What ails you? If you did not make such a gloomy face, you would be quite good-looking." "Well, if you really wish me to, I will sit down for a moment," said Jonah. "But pray, who are you? I have never in all my life before beheld anyone half so beautiful." "I am the Princess Good Fortune, and this is my father's garden." "What are you doing here, all by yourself?" he asked. "Oh, I feed my deer and polish my crown." "And then?" "Then I feed my goldfish." "And when you're through feeding them?" "Oh, then my companions come back, and we sing and dance and laugh." "What a life! What a happy life!" sighed Jonah. "But tell me, is this what you do every day?" "Yes, every single day," she answered. "But come, it's my turn to ask questions. Who are you, and what is your name?" "Please do not ask me that, beautiful princess," he begged. "I am the most unfortunate of mortals, and have the most detestable name under the sun." "An ugly name is a misfortune," she replied. "We have a man here who is called Duckweed, and another is named Grease Spot. Is your name anything like that?" "No," he replied sadly. "I am Jonah." "Jonah? That's enough to make one die a-laughing," she declared. "Can't you take a different name?" "I will think up a pretty name, suitable for you, and will ask my father to give you permission to bear it. My father can do anything he pleases, for he is king of this land. But mind, I will do it only on condition that you wear a glad face. Take your hand away from your face, and stop pulling down the corners of your mouth. You really have a nice mouth, but you will spoil it completely if you keep on like this. There. Now you do look a little more sensible. But come, tell me, why are you always so sad? Now I am always happy, and everybody with whom I talk seems so, except you." "Why am I so sad?" repeated Jonah. "Because I have always been sad, all my life long. Why should I be anything but sad? All I have ever had has been misfortune." "You say you were always joyful. How did you begin being so?" "Oh, I had a fairy godmother," she made reply, "for whom my father once did a great service. When I was christened, she took me in her arms, kissed me upon the brow, and said, 'You shall always be joyful, and make the whole world rejoice. And if by any chance a sad mortal gazes on you, he shall straightway forget his woes. You shall be called Good Fortune.' Evidently no fairy ever kissed you, Sir Jonah." "No, indeed," lamented poor Jonah. "Never." Thereupon the princess became very thoughtful. She gazed steadily at him with her large blue eyes until he became quite uncomfortable. At length she murmured, "I wonder if it must always be a fairy. A princess has some power also. I do believe I'll try it." Aloud she said, "Come here. Kneel down. You are far too tall." She bent down and kissed him, then ran laughingly away. Before he could collect his wits, she had disappeared from view. He arose very slowly. He had a strange sensation, as though he had just awakened from a dream. And yet it had been no dream, for a wonderful happiness was beginning to steal over his heart. "If only I had my hat," he sighed, "I would toss it up into the air for joy." Then he added, "No doubt it would trill a roundelay and soar away on skylark pinions. That's what I feel like doing myself. Hip, hip, hooray! I really believe I'm getting merry. Wouldn't that be wonderful?" He picked a bouquet of flowers and wandered out upon the highway, singing at the top of his voice. As soon as he reached the next town, he bought a red velvet doublet slashed with white satin, and a hat with a long trailing white feather. He looked at himself in the glass and said, "Jonah's my name, is it? Well, we'll see. Perhaps I'll be given another name ere long. But it will have to be a very pretty one, or I'll not take it." Then he mounted a horse and put spurs to it, that it might prance merrily, and continued his journey. Meantime, after giving Jonah the kiss, Princess Good Fortune had run and run at full speed. After a while, she ran more and more slowly, and at last she sat down on a bench not far from the castle and began to weep bitterly. When her friends returned, they found her weeping. They endeavored to console her, but could not. So, in a great fright, they ran to the king and told him that a great misfortune had befallen the land. Princess Good Fortune was in the garden crying. The king turned pale with fright when he heard it, and sprang quickly down the steps into the garden. And there, sure enough, he found the princess on a bench, crying as though her heart would break. Her golden crown was lying on her lap, covered with the many tears she had shed, and glistening in the sun as though it were set with 1,000 diamonds. The king tried in vain to comfort her. She was inconsolable. So he led her into the castle, and hastened to dispatch messengers far and wide over the land, in search of beautiful and costly gifts to lavish on her. All to no purpose, for she remained sad and sorrowful, and though often pressed by her father as to what had occurred to so grieve her, would give him no satisfaction. The king was very persistent, and kept on questioning her every day. And at last, one day, in sheer desperation, the princess broke down and told him all that had happened. The king held up his hands in horror. Had she, in truth, taken leave of her senses to have so far forgotten her dignity? He could scarcely believe his ears. Then he insisted upon being told why she had done such an unmaidenly thing. She replied that she pitied Jonah so, she did it to see whether she could not make him a little less unhappy. A pretty reason for a princess to kiss the first hatless, ragged vagabond who crosses her path, stormed her father. And named Jonah to boot. Did anyone ever hear the equal of such folly? But he shall pay for it, the king raged on, and dearly. I'll catch him yet, and when I do, he shall be beheaded. That is the very least punishment I can inflict for so dire an offense. Thereupon he commanded his horsemen to scatter in all directions to search for Jonah. If you come across a young vagabond who looks as sad as if the mice had eaten his last bite of bread and butter away from him, and is without a hat, fetch him thither at once, for he it is that you are seeking. The horsemen sped in all directions, like chaff before a wind. Some few of them passed Jonah on the way, but as he was clad in elegant apparel, and mounted on a prancing steed, it is not at all strange that they did not recognize him. Others hastened back to the palace with prisoners of all descriptions, none of whom was the one so eagerly awaited. Finally the king became angry at the stupidity of his messengers, and scored them all roundly. But the princess remained as sad as ever during all this time, and came to the table every day with pale cheeks and tear-stained eyes. The king could do naught but gaze in compassion at his once beautiful daughter, and soup and roast grew cold, unheeded. Week followed week. Then there came a day when the whole courtyard rang with a sudden commotion. But before the king could reach the window to ascertain the cause, 2 horsemen burst into the room, with the unfortunate Jonah between them. His hands were bound behind his back, but his face fairly beamed, as if nothing more to his liking could have befallen him. He made a low courtesy, then drew himself proudly erect, and stood before the king, awaiting his pleasure. "We've caught the fine bird at last, your majesty," said the elder of the captors. "But he certainly must have changed his plumage in between times, for your description fits him as one's fist fits one's eyes. We never would have found him had not the stupid dolt, in a fit of bragging, told us the story himself, while we were all stopping at an inn. And what do you suppose he did when we captured and bound him? Just laughed and sang and danced for joy. And when we set him on his horse and mounted ours on either side of him to gallop thither, what think you he did? Scolded and raged because we rode not more swiftly. He acted for all the world as though he could scarcely wait to be beheaded. If he is the saddest mortal in Christendom, your Majesty, I should indeed like to see the merriest. Thereupon the king crossed over to where Jonah stood, folded his arms, and said, "So, you are the man who had the temerity to allow a princess to kiss you?" "Yes, your Majesty, and I have been the happiest man on earth ever since," laughed the other. "Lock him up in a dungeon," roared the king. "Tomorrow he shall be executed." The horseman hastened to lead him to the dungeon tower, and the king walked up and down his chamber, lost in thought. "What a terrible affair," he mused. "I have the rascal, it is true, and he shall die tomorrow. But will that restore my beloved daughter's lost happiness?" Then he stole softly to her chamber door, to listen at the keyhole. But the sounds of muffled sobs that reached his ear made him shake his head sadly, and retreat to his own room. After thinking it all over once more, he sent for his secret counselor. To him he imparted the whole story of the princess's folly. The latter thought it all over carefully ere he offered his advice. At length he said, "I know not whether it will prove effectual, but, at any rate, it can do no harm to try. It is known that this Jonah was formerly very sad, yet is now the Prince of Jollity. Also that our beautiful princess, who was formerly always merry, is now inconsolably sad. Therefore it is plainly evident there was magic in the kiss which worked the change. Clearly the kiss is to blame for it all. Likewise there can be but one remedy. Jonah must give the princess back her kiss, O your Majesty." But the king waxed wroth, and declared such a proceeding quite impossible, and quite contrary to all the customs of his race. "Your Majesty must regard the entire affair as an official act, therefore a state secret. Then all will be well once more, and no one will dare breathe a word about it." After arguing the matter at some length, the king was won over. So he donned his robes of state, and called all his knights and courtiers to the presence chamber. Guards were at once dispatched to the dungeon to lead the prisoner thither. As soon as he was seated on the throne, the king sent for his daughter, without telling her why her presence was desired. She came at once, and took her place at his side. Perfect silence reigned, until the door opened to admit Jonah. The king addressed the culprit as follows: "You shall be beheaded tomorrow, as I have already said. But before that event takes place, you will now, this very instant, and in the presence of my assembled court, return to my daughter the kiss she so rashly bestowed upon you." "If such is your desire, O king," returned Jonah, "I will most gladly comply with your request. And were it possible for mortal man to be more happy than I am at the present moment, no doubt I shall speedily become so." "We shall see," interrupted the king harshly. "It is just possible that there may be a mistake in your calculations this time." But Jonah, his face wreathed in smiles, did not appear to be listening. Instead, he crossed over to where the princess stood, took her tenderly in his arms, and bestowed a rapturous kiss upon her lips. "By the order of the king," he whispered laughingly. She clasped her arms around his neck, and there they stood, lost in ecstasy. "Well, my daughter, are you happy once more?" broke in the king. "A little bit, dear father," answered the princess, "but you know it will not be for long." "Yes, yes," returned the latter. "I see. If the scheme had been a success, he would have become sorrowful again by this time. But there he stands, as smiling and as unabashed as ever. Whatever shall we do?" Then the princess dropped her eyes and softly answered, "I know, dear father, and I shall tell you, but it must be told in secret." Thereupon the king retired into the antechamber, and what took place there none ever knew. Only when they returned, the king led her straight over to Jonah, placed her hand in his, and spake to the assembled court. "Courtiers and friends, it is useless to struggle against fate. God's will be done. This is my dear son, who will reign in my stead when I die. I bid you give him welcome." And so Jonah became a prince, and went to live in the stately palace, and he gave the princess so many kisses that in time she became even happier than before. And he was no longer Jonah. No, indeed. Instead, she called him by the prettiest names she could think of, a different one each day, and each one lovelier than the last.